Today's podcast will feature sailing horror stories. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Survivor's Guilt. While sailors are known to have many customs of the sea, there is one custom that is exceptionally dark, and once it begins, there's no going back. And that is the custom we will talk about in this story. And the second and final story you'll hear is called the KI, and it's about three friends' trip of a lifetime that turns into a nightmare. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please go through all of the Amazon Music follow button social media posts and be sure to correct all of their fans' spelling and grammar mistakes in the comment section. Okay, let's get into our first story called Survivor's Guilt. On the morning of February 6, 1821, three young men stood on the deck of a small boat out in the Pacific Ocean. The sun was out, it was beautiful and warm. The water was crystal blue, but none of these four men were paying any attention to their surroundings. Instead, all of them were just standing there in total silence, staring at each other. Finally, one of the four men spoke up. His name was Owen Coffin, and he was 18 years old. And Owen, like the other three men, had grown up on the water. In fact, all four of these men had grown up on this small island called Nantucket, off the coast of Massachusetts, where the main industry there was whaling, which meant sailors like these four men would go out and hunt whales and slaughter them for their oil. So, from the time Owen and the rest of these men were very little, they were out on the water learning how to sail, and they were also learning the customs of the sea. And there was one custom in particular that Owen wanted to talk about right now with the other three men. So, in a very serious and hushed tone, Owen asked the question of the other three men that sailors referred to as the delicate question. And after Owen asked the so-called delicate question, the other three men, who were already very serious and just kind of standing there in silence, suddenly their eyes started to go wide and their mouths went agape. And then again, all of the men just kind of fell into total silence. The only sound they could hear was the splashing of the waves against the side of the boat. The captain of this vessel was a man named George Pollard. He was 28 years old and he was actually Owen's older cousin. And what George wanted to say to Owen in response to his delicate question was no. But George didn't say that. Instead, he just put his hands up over his mouth and stared kind of incredulously at Owen and the other two men, who were also teenagers. Their names were Charles and Barzillai. And as he stared at these other three men, he realized that their answers to the delicate question was a resounding yes. They knew it had to be a yes. They had to do this. And even though George could totally override them because he was the captain and so technically in charge, he knew in this situation, under this particular custom, he couldn't overrule them. And so, with his hands still over his mouth, George just nodded a yes. Yes, let's go forward with this custom. And so, with a unanimous decision to move forward, Owen slowly reached down and pulled out the ship's logbook from underneath one of the seats behind him. And then he opened up the book and he flipped to the back pages of the logbook, which were totally blanked. And he grabbed one of the pieces of paper and he ripped it out of the book. Then Owen began to rip this piece of paper into strips. First, he ripped three identically long pieces of paper and he held up all three at the same time to show the others that these are the three that are the three that are these are the three. Same. And each of the three nodded their head. Yes, we see that. And then Owen reached down, he grabbed the paper again, and he ripped a fourth strip out, and this one was dramatically shorter than the other three. And so Owen held up this much shorter piece and he showed Charles, George, and Barzillai, and again they all kind of nodded in agreement. Yes, we see that's the short piece. And so, once the whole group was satisfied that they had their four strips, Owen took off his hat. He put all four of the strips inside, mixed it around, and held out his hat. It was time. The first man to reach into Owen's hat was Owen's older cousin and the captain, George. He reached in, he pulled one of the strips of paper out, closed it in his fist so he had no idea which one it was, and pulled it back and held it close to his chest. And then one by one, each of the other men did the same thing, reaching in, grabbing their strip, not looking at it, and holding it against their chest. And then once all the strips had been taken, at the exact same time, all 4 men extended their hands into the middle of the circle they were standing in. And they opened their hands palm up to reveal which strip they got. And George, Charles, and Bars Eli all had the identical long pieces. And Owen, the 18-year-old, the younger cousin of the captain, the one who had ripped up the strips, he had the short strips. And immediately when his older cousin George saw this, he yelled out, "No, let me take that one." But Owen said, "No, this is customary. I want this." And so, after a few moments of the men kind of collecting themselves and calming down, Charles then grabbed the logbook again, flipped to the back of it, pulled out another blank page, and he ripped it into strips again. Except now he was only ripping them into 3 strips, 2 long that were identical and 1 short. And once again, as he ripped them, he held them up to show the other men, to show this was a fair process. Then Charles took off his hat, put the 3 strips inside, and extended it to George and Bars Eli. Owen was not a part of this round, and so George and Bars Eli, one by one, reached in, took their strip, held it to their chest, and then Charles, he would take the last strip, he would hold it to his chest, and then once all the men had their pieces, they held their hands out into the middle of their now smaller circle. They opened their hands palm up, and this time it would be Charles, the man who ripped up this second round, who would discover he had the short strip. And as soon as Charles saw this, he threw it on the ground and he ran to the other side of the boat and began screaming, "I can't do this. I can't do it." Meanwhile, Owen, George, and Bars Eli didn't even move or flinch. They just stood there waiting for Charles to calm down because he knew, this was a very important custom. And once you begin doing it, you can't just stop. Charles would have to come back over and play his role. And so after a few minutes of Charles still kind of calling out that he couldn't do this, tears are coming down his face. He finally wiped the tears, he calmed himself down, and he walked back over to the group who, again, they hadn't moved. George, Bars Eli, and Owen, they're just standing there waiting to continue this custom. And so as Charles began coming back over looking ready to continue, George, without even saying anything, reached down and unlatched a door on the side of the boat. He opened it up, he reached in, and he pulled out this long object that was wrapped in canvas, and then he handed this object to Charles. And then once Charles had possession of this object, Owen, the man who had first drawn the short piece of paper, said to the group, "Now it's time for a moment of silence," even though at this point none of the men were talking. But still, they formed a tight circle with Charles holding this object, and they all bowed their heads and they just stood there in total silence. And then once Owen raised his head, the other 3 did as well, and Owen, one by one, touched the shoulders of each of the men and reminded them that this had been a fair process. Then, without saying another word, Owen turned away from the group. He walked over to the edge of the boat, looking out over the water. He got down on his knees, he made sure his posture was good, and he looked out over the water. Owen had always loved the ocean, even though his own father had died out at sea. But this particular whaling expedition that Owen had been on, he thought went extremely well, and he was very proud of what they had all accomplished. And Owen was especially proud to be a part of this particular custom. This custom was one that so few people ever took part in, but all sailors knew about it. It was kind of like the forbidden custom, and here he was playing a central role which really required a lot of strength. And so feeling very proud of himself, Owen, after looking out over the water for a few more moments, he bent down and put his chin on the edge of the boat, which signaled to Charles it was time. And then once Charles saw that Owen was in position, he stepped away from George and Bars Eli and walked over to Owen carrying this object wrapped in canvas. And then once he was right behind Owen, without saying a word to him, he unwrapped the object and it was a rifle. And once the rifle was uncovered, he placed the barrel against the back of Owen's head and then he fired a shot. And instantly, Owen slumped to the ground, dead. And Charles kind of staggered back and fell on the deck and let out the strangled scream. He couldn't believe what he had just done, but he knew there was no other choice. Once they decided to do this sacred custom, they had to take it to the end. And so George, who had just witnessed the execution of his younger cousin, was deeply troubled in pain. But he too knew they had to bring this custom to the finish line, which meant it was George's turn to step forward and play his part. And so George walked up to his now dead younger cousin, and George pulled out a serrated knife and cut off Owen's head. And then once Owen's head was removed, he placed it on the deck so Owen's face was looking away from the other men, like he couldn't see what they were going to do. And then once the head was in place, George went back to Owen's body and began cutting him open and pulling his organs out and handing them to Charles and Barzilla. George also began cutting off long strips of Owen's flesh, creating sort of like fillets. And then even though there was a spot on the boat to have a fire, the three men decided they just could not wait, and before long, the only sound that could be heard on board this little boat floating out at sea on the Pacific Ocean was the sound of Charles, George, and Barzilla tearing into Owen's raw flesh with their teeth, turning their beards bright red with his blood. The delicate question that Owen asked the other men at the beginning of this story was one of the most feared questions among sailors, and it was only asked if there was a shipwreck or some sort of emergency that happened out at sea, which meant the group had almost no chance of survival. Only in those circumstances was the delicate question appropriate. And what it was, do we draw lots to determine which one of us dies so the other can eat them in order to have a better chance at survival? And so, during that first round when Owen had drawn the short strip of paper that determined he would be the one who was murdered unbeaten, and then in the second round when Charles drew the short strip of paper that meant he would be the one to kill Owen. On February 6, 1821, the day that Owen posed the delicate question, he and the other three men had been lost at sea for the past 3 months after a whale had struck the side of their whaling boat and left them adrift with almost no food and no water. There had been other men on board the Essex who had died from starvation and exposure, and their bodies had been consumed by the surviving sailor, until on February 6th they were down to just these 4 men and no more bodies to eat, which is why they decided there was time. They had to ask the delicate question. 17 days after Owen sacrificed himself, so the others could eat him, another boat happened to drift past the stranded Essex boat, which now only contained Charles and George. Barzilla had died of starvation 5 days after they killed Owen, and Barzilla had been eaten by George and Charles as well. And as this other ship passed by the Essex and they looked on board, all they saw were skeletons of the men that had died and been eaten. And Charles and George were on opposite ends of the boat, curled up in a ball, chewing on human finger bones, trying to get the last bits of flesh off. And their bodies were totally emaciated. Their hair and their beards were wild. They looked totally feral. And then, when this boat actually came up alongside the Essex and boarded to rescue Charles and George looked terrified. It was like they had totally lost their grip on reality. They had been lost at sea for 94 days and had consumed all of their friends, and so it makes sense they might go kind of crazy. But after this crew was able to get Charles and George fed and get them water and cleaned up, they kind of regained their composure and their sanity, and they were very thankful and happy to be alive. The story of what happened to the crew of the Essex quickly spread all around the world, and in fact, it served as inspiration for Herman Melville to write his classic American novel, Moby Dick. The next and final story of today's episode is called The KAZI. A little after 7:00 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 2007, 3 men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the KAZI from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the KAZI was 56-year-old D.Z. Batten, and for months he'd been training for this trip. And the 2 friends that D.Z. was bringing with him on this trip were Jim T.U. Stead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother Peter T.U. Stead, who was 16 years old. All 3 of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination and where all 3 men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all three men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now DZ, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 years. DZ had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement. And this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all 3 of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering, and how much prep went into it, and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the 3 men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, you know, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other 2 men laughing in the background. And it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually Peter told his wife that he had to go, He told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now DEZ, who was the captain of the KAZII, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip, even though all 3 men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience. And even though DEZ was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so, literally, could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, DEZ made Jim and Peter go through all these man-overboard drills on the KAs, to make sure they knew how to do it if, for some reason, you know, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also, when they charted their course, DEZ stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time, just because it was safer. And so, when Jim began filming a video around 10, dear OM, on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video. So they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know DEZ, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the KAZII before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the KAs, a white 35-foot catamaran, sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean, away from the coastline. Now remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants and so has no idea that Peter and Jim had been so clear about Kibimada. At no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that, and so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water, and she thought, okay, whatever, you know. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on, when details emerged about what happened on the KAZII, that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw the boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, 2 more people would spot the KAZII. These were 2 men who also did not know DEZ, Peter, Jim. They didn't know KAZII. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these 2 men didn't know each other, but independently on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the KAZII sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now remember, the KAZII was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the KAZII would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later. But here we were 24 hours later, and 2 more people are seeing the KAZII in the same place that Isabel had seen it. And so that made no sense. But, again, these 2 men who saw the KAZII, they just saw it and thought nothing of it because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then one more day after that, on April 17, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the two other men had seen the KAZI on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the KAZI. And again, these fishermen do not know the KAZI. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing the ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the KAZI, they thought something was wrong, because they saw the KAZI from a distance, navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the KAZI was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looks so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Peter and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the KAZI. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the KAZI with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the KAZI to see if they were okay. But no one from the KAZI called back to the helicopter. And so, as they're waiting for a response from the KAZI, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the KAZI clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the KAZI, and when they got there, the KAZI was gone. At this point, the Marine police got some information about the boat KAZI and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip. So Peter and Jim and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that, besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency. And so a search was launched to find the KAZI. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the KAZI. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water. And from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Peter and Jim could be held hostage down below along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen and Peter and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water. And then Corey swam by himself over to the KAZI and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck. And right away, he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Peter and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. Then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat. and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water. It was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there were just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling, and so Corey turned it off. Now at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Peter and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job, and so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th, so the day the KZII set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on, and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old, that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also, Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously, the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem: DZ, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Jim, and Peter weren't ever found, and so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things, like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so, unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. It was a frigid December day in a small logging town in Maine, roughly an hour's drive from the US-Canadian border. But despite the falling snow, Christmas shoppers were out in full force. While most of the shoppers hurried from store to store, a small crowd had gathered in front of the police station. The shoppers watched as an officer stapled a poster to a telephone pole, then, when he was done and stepped aside, they all shuffled closer for a better view. The poster was a sketch of a middle-aged woman. She had a narrow face, thin nose, glasses, and bangs. And according to the text above the image, the police were looking for this woman in connection with a recent double homicide. The murders were horrible, but they were also the most exciting thing to happen in this part of rural Maine for as long as anyone could remember. So, despite the cold and the need to go buy Christmas gifts, these shoppers all stood there studying the sketch and discussing whether it looked like anyone they knew when they knew. And these shoppers were so caught up in their conversation that they didn't notice a bundled-up figure hurrying past them on the sidewalk. And this figure slowed down just long enough to glance at the poster and recognize the face in the sketch, which bore a striking resemblance to their own face. Then, before anyone could notice them, the figure turned and hurried off into the falling snow. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please give the follow button's phone number to as many telemarketers as you can. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the evening of November 27, 2009, Michael Miller, or Big Mike, as pretty much everyone knew him, was stomping around his property in Webster Plantation, Maine, studying his double-wide trailer and thinking through the new addition he was planning. Like his nickname suggested, 47-year-old Big Mike was a huge man, and he had a big bushy beard, and he looked right at home in this desolate, rural setting. The trailer stood at the center of a snowy clearing along the edge of dark woods. There were no other buildings in sight, since Big Mike's closest neighbor lived almost 20 miles away. His hometown of Webster Plantation wasn't really a town at all. It had a population of 85 people, a one-room town hall, 2 roads, and no street lights. There had never really been much to do there aside from, creek fishing and taking in the nature, and for a lot of people, working at the local lumber mill. Big Mike had been a seasonal employee there for 29 years, but just 1 week ago, he'd been laid off. The loss of his job had stung, but he wasn't too worried. He and his wife Val lived frugally, and so they had enough cash stowed away to get by until he found another job. Big Mike was just about to head back inside when he heard a vehicle approaching. He turned to see a pair of headlights sweep through the trees. Then a familiar white Ford Explorer came into view and pulled up to his mobile home. It was his 2 sons, 27-year-old Mike Jr. and 26-year-old Matt. Mike Jr., the oldest son, was like a smaller, clean-shaven version of Big Mike. But Matt was a lot different. He was skinny and pale, with a buzz cut and tattoos along his neck. Matt also had heavy shadows under his eyes, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Big Mike had not expected to see his kids tonight, but was happy for the visit. So, he walked up and gave them each a big hug and invited them inside. Then, he called out to Val that the boys had stopped by for a visit, and within seconds, his wife appeared from the kitchen with a tin of her famous coffee, cakes, and ham. At 47 years old, Val was a very energetic and petite woman who looked even smaller standing next to her hulking husband. The family snacked and caught up, and then Val reminded everyone that they had a birthday tomorrow. Matt's baby daughter was turning 1. However, Matt still had not told anyone what the party plans were. Matt said they weren't really planning on doing anything, which Val immediately insisted was ridiculous. She said if Matt didn't want to plan something, well, she and Big Mike would be more than happy to host the party at their place. Matt tried to dissuade her, but finally just caved and agreed to let her host the party, as long as it was small, just immediate family along with Mike Jr., Matt's girlfriend, as well as Mike Jr.'s best friend, May. The 3 of them were practically family anyway. Then Matt excused himself undasked if Big Mike could step outside for a moment. Big Mike's jaw instantly tensed. He could guess where this was heading. And sure enough, the moment they were outside together, Matt asked his father if he could borrow some money. Matt began talking about how he hadn't worked in months and was struggling with all the costs of a new baby. He couldn't even afford gifts or a cake for tomorrow. That's why they hadn't planned a party. When he finally finished his spiel, Big Mike told Matt not to worry about the cake. He and Val would be happy to pick one up before the party. But he couldn't lend Matt money at the moment. For one thing, Big Mike told his younger son that he'd himself just been laid off from his job at the mill, so money was tight for him. And more importantly, he couldn't trust that Matt would actually use the money for his family. Matt looked absolutely furious at his father's response, but he did not push the issue. He just shook his head and headed back into the mobile home where he asked if Mike Jr. was ready to go. The boys left a few minutes later, giving Val a kiss on the cheek before climbing into Matt's Ford Explorer. Big Mike watched the SUV disappear into the forest, wondering if he had been too hard on Matt. Then he heard Val calling, and he turned to head back inside. Around 12:40 p.m. the next day, so Saturday, November 28th, another car pulled up outside of Big Mike and Val's mobile home. The driver climbed out, grabbed a red plastic gas can from the back seat, and started trudging through the snow toward the trailer. The driver's name was Alan Richardson, and he was a neighbor and friend of Big Mike and Val's. Alan had borrowed the gas can from Big Mike a few days earlier, and he was here now to return it. However, when he reached the trailer and knocked on the door, no one responded. Alan tried the door handle and found it was locked. Now, normally, Alan would have assumed that the Millers had just left to run an errand, but he looked and saw both of their vehicles were parked nearby it. So he tried knocking again, and when he got no response again, he moved to the nearest window and peered inside. Tilting his head, he was able to make out what appeared to be homemade birthday decorations taped to one wall. There were also paper plates and a few liters of soda sitting out on the counter. It looked like Big Mike and Val were getting ready for a party. But just then, he noticed something disturbing on the kitchen floor. It took him a moment to realize what he was even looking at, but once he did, he nearly fell over backward, because Big Mike and Val were both sprawled on the floor beside each other, not moving. Once Alan got over the initial shock, he rapped on the glass and called out to them, but they didn't move at all. Alan's hand shook as he pulled out his phone and punched in 9111. The moment the dispatcher picked up, Alan told them he'd just discovered the Millers unconscious in their trailer with the door locked. He asked if he should break in and try to help them, but the dispatcher told him that could be dangerous. Whatever caused the Millers to collapse could still be in there, whether it was an electrical problem, or a carbon monoxide leak, or something else. And so, the dispatcher instructed Alan to simply wait until the authorities arrived, which unfortunately would take a while since the nearest police station was over 30 miles away. Alan was still waiting nervously outside the mobile home when he heard sirens approaching through the woods. An ambulance rounded a bend in the trees, followed by a police cruiser and a fire engine, and they all pulled up in front of Alan, lights flashing. A police officer wearing a respirator mask told Alan to stand aside, and everyone waited while the firefighters tested the air around the door for carbon monoxide. When they announced that the coast was clear, the police first opened the door and entered the mobile home, followed by a pair of ants. And what they found there in the kitchen was Big Mike, lying flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling with his legs folded awkwardly beneath him. His wife Val was slumped by his side with her head resting on his chest. Their skin was waxy and pale, they weren't breathing, and there was a small amount of blood on the floor around them. The EMS checked for a pulse to be certain, but it was obvious the Millers were dead. And as soon as the EMS looked more closely, it became clear what killed the Millers, and it was not carbon monoxide. They noticed a small hole in Val's right temple and a similar one at the base of Big Mike's skull. The Millers had been shot. Meanwhile, Alan continued to wait outside, watching the activity from a distance and calling everyone he knew to tell them about his awful discovery. At the same time, local police and medical personnel continued to arrive one by one, until an entire fleet of law enforcement vehicles filled the clearing. Finally, about a half an hour after the EMS first entered the mobile home, lead investigators Darryl Peary and Brian Stroud of the Maine State Police arrived. The detectives stepped out of their car, quickly introduced themselves to Alan, and then said they had a few questions for him. They wanted to know how Alan knew the Millers and why he was visiting that morning. He told them about borrowing the gas can and said that Big Mike and Val were some of his favorite neighbors, as good-natured and helpful as you could find. He also mentioned that he'd been surprised to find the door locked when he arrived. People around here typically left their doors unlocked. The detectives collected Alan's contact information and then told him he could leave. After that, they headed inside. Detective Perry's first thought upon entering the mobile home was just how neat everything was. When he got the call for 2 potential deaths at a trailer in the woods, he'd sort of half expected the place to be a cluttered mess, possibly even a drug den or meth lab. Instead, he found a tidy living room full of family photos and birthday decorations. This was a well-cared-for home, a very crowded home at the moment, since police officers were still busy photographing everything in sight. The detectives slipped through the crowd and made their way to the kitchen, where they found the medical examiner crouching over the Millers. Detective Strout leaned down close to examine the bullet hole in Val's right temple. As he did, Perry commented that there wasn't a lot of blood in the kitchen for a pair of gunshot wounds, and the medical examiner agreed, explaining that the murder weapon had to be a small, underpowered handgun like a .22. The detectives perked up when they heard this, because they knew such a small gun like a .22 would most likely be used at very close range. And if Big Mike was shot up close from behind, it suggested one of two things. Either he had been held at gunpoint and executed, or he knew his killer and trusted them well enough to invite them into his kitchen and then turn his back on them. Just as they were figuring out which was more likely, a police officer hurried over and said they just found something the detectives would want to see. Strout and P followed this officer to a small room that was full of shelves. They were stocked floor to ceiling with used electronics, stacks of DVDs, tools, and a small arsenal of firearms. Strout and Perry began walking through the room, pulling out random bins to check on the contents. They couldn't imagine what all this merchandise was doing here. But before they could figure it out, there was a commotion outside. The detectives went back to the living room and looked out the window at a young man in his late 20s flailing his arms in frustration, while a sheriff's deputy blocked him from entering the front door. The man kept repeating that he needed to see his mother and father until finally, the deputy just said, "I'm sorry, Mike, they're gone." At that point, the young man began to sob, then he stumbled back to his truck, which was parked alongside all the other law enforcement vehicles. By the time the detectives reached the man, he was sitting in the driver's seat with the door open, repeatedly trying to call someone on his cell phone. Strout and Peary introduced themselves to the young man, who replied that he was Mike Jr., the miller's oldest son. They asked him why he had come to his parents' place, and he explained that he just heard from a friend that there was some kind of an accident at his mom and dad's place, and so he had rushed over as fast as he could. But he'd never expected to learn that both of his parents were dead. Mike Jr. said he had spent the last few minutes desperately trying to call his younger brother Matt. Mike wanted to be the one to break the news before Matt heard it from someone else, but unfortunately, Matt wasn't picking up. Now Mike Jr. set his phone aside and turned to Strout and peer why. He had the look of a man who was in shock, but he said he wanted to help and then offered to tell them anything they wanted to know. The detectives asked him if there was any reason he could think of that somebody might want to hurt his parents. Mike Jr. said what most people say in this situation right after they lose a loved one. He said his parents were great people and everybody loved them. However, as he said this, a worried look came across his face, and he told the detectives that while his dad had worked at the mill, whenever times got tough, he would supplement his income with a lucrative side hustle, operating a pawn shop and loan shark business right out of his mobile home. He said his father also bought and sold prescription narcotics. The whole operation was unlicensed and totally illegal, but this far from civilization, most people didn't care. Big Mike had a long list of regular customers who would often stop by out of the blue. This information cast the murders in a whole new light for the detectives. Big Mike and Val weren't just some respected couple mysteriously gunned down in their family home. They were the owners of a shady, illegal business that very likely could have turned their trailer into a revolving door of unsavory characters. And the detectives figured Big Mike must have had large amounts of cash on hand to run his lone business. Maybe a desperate individual who did business with Mike saw him as an easy target. Detective Strout was now itching to get back inside the mobile home and verify whether anything was missing. But first, he asked Mike Jr. when he last heard from his parents. Mike Jr. said he'd spoken to his mother around 10:00 a.m. that morning to firm up details for his niece's birthday party, which Big Mike and Val were supposed to host that afternoon at their mobile home. Mike also said it sounded like his parents weren't alone because when he spoke to her, he heard people talking in the background, and he actually recognized one of the voices as his cousin, a man who was named Clayton Gideon. The detectives made a note that Clayton Gideon could have been the last person to see the Millers alive. After they wrapped up with Mike Jr., Detective Strout called the state police headquarters to try to get background information on Clayton. At the same time, Peary went back inside the trailer. He wanted to get a second look at the storage room where Big Mike had been running his business. And when he got back there and looked around at the cluttered space, it was impossible to say for sure whether anything had been taken. That is, until Peary found an orderly stack of ledgers on a shelf. Flipping through these pages, it quickly became clear that Big Mike had kept meticulous records. Everything he bought or sold and every dime he lent was marked and dated. And from the information on these records, Perry could see that a safe, where Mike stored jewelry and other high-value items, was clearly missing. He also couldn't find one ledger book from the set, which looked like it was the one that was used to track Big Mike's loans. And so, Perry was thinking more than ever that robbery had to be the motive for the murders when his partner, Detective Stroud, came in to join him. Stroud said he had just spoken to the office, who had given him an address for Clayton G. ID'd Mike Jr.'s cousin. He was located in the nearby tiny town of Springfield. Stroud told his partner that Clayton was apparently an avid hunter, which meant he very likely owned a lot of guns. Now, both detectives were even more eager to talk to him. Later that afternoon, when Stroud and Perry knocked on Clayton's door, a young girl answered. She ran to get her father and returned moments later with a man in his mid-30s. Clayton was clearly shaken up, as though he'd already heard the news about his aunt and uncle's deaths. However, when the detectives told him that Big Mike and Val were murdered, Clayton seemed startled, and then he became even more distraught when he realized he was a potential suspect. But Detective Perry promised Clayton they were only there to talk, so Clayton took a few calming breaths. Then he invited them into the living room. Clayton told the detectives that he had driven out to have coffee with his aunt and uncle that morning, and he had taken his 9-year-old daughter with him. When they arrived at their mobile home around 10, Owen, Big Mike and Val were at ease and looking forward to the birthday party later that day. There was no sign of any trouble, and the couple did not seem like they were in danger. Detective Stroud listened patiently, while at the same time studying the man for any sign that he might be lying. But Clayton seemed genuinely shocked, and if his daughter really had been there that morning, Stroud had a hard time believing that Clayton was the killer. After all, who could commit murder in front of their own child? But suddenly, Clayton said something that made both detectives lean forward in their seats. He told them that he and his daughter were not the only ones at the Miller's place that morning. When they arrived, Big Mike and Val were already chatting with a young man named Nate Nightingale. Clayton didn't know exactly why Nate was there or what he was doing, but he said he didn't find it that unusual. Nate was Mike Jr.'s best friend, and he hung around the Miller's place all the time. But Clayton said the detective should still talk to him because when Clayton left the trailer at 10, Nate was still there. Hearing this, Stroud and Perry could both feel the case starting to pick up speed. The Millers had been dead for only a matter of hours, but already the detectives had a potential witness who might have been in the room when the murders happened. When the detectives met at the state police office the following day, November 29th, they found new information waiting for them. The autopsy results had come in, and they confirmed that Big Mike and Val were killed with the .22 caliber pistol. This cemented the detectives' suspicions that they'd both been shot at close range, likely right there in their kitchen. The office had also pulled Big Mike's phone records, showing that he called a friend at 10:00 a.m. The detectives would contact this friend, and they would confirm that, yep, Big Mike had called them, and during their conversation, nothing had seemed off. That left an arrow to our window when Big Mike and Val could have been shot. Big Mike was very much alive at 10. Adrift was dead by 12:44 p.m. when Alan Richardson, the neighbor, had called 911. So, Stroud and Perry got to work tracking down Nate Nightingale, perhaps the last known person to see the victims alive. But they were also eager to speak with Matt Miller, the younger son of Big Mike and Val, who still was not answering his phone. And as they would find out, Nate Nightingale and Matt lived right near each other. So the detectives set out to pay them each a visit. Matt's apartment was closer to the station, so Stroud and Perry headed there first. And from the moment Matt answered the door, the detectives could sense that something was just off. The 26-year-old had shadows under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. But it was actually Matt's behavior, not his appearance, that really got their attention. Matt was not acting like someone who just lost his parents. He didn't show signs of grief or even press the detectives for any details on the progress of the case. Instead, he seemed nervous and evasive, almost like he just wanted Stroud and Perry to leave as soon as possible. And the detectives responded to this behavior by actually pressing him on his whereabouts the previous day. He told them he had just been driving around Lincoln with his girlfriend Tanya and their infant daughter, picking up last-minute items for the birthday party that afternoon. Matt's alibi was short on details, and the way Matt refused to meet their eyes as he spoke made the detectives even more suspicious. And also, Tanya was out running errands with the baby, so she couldn't even confirm Matt's story. Stroud felt sure that Matt must be hiding something, so he tried asking about his relationship with Big Mike and Val. Was he on good terms with his parents? Matt brushed the question off, saying of course he was on fine terms with them. They were his parents. And then after that, No matter what the detectives asked, Matt gave similarly curt responses. It eventually became clear the detectives were not going to get much more from him today, so they got a cell phone number for Matt's girlfriend, Tanya, and told him they'd follow up soon. And then, they left to go talk to the next person on their list, Nate Nightingale. After their interview with Matt, speaking to Nate was like a breath of fresh air. From the moment Nate answered the door, he was polite and eager to help. Nate was clearly upset and told the detectives that he'd been close to the Millers for years. He had been best friends with Mike Jr. since high school, and he considered the Millers' trailer like his second home. Detective Perry asked Nate what he had been doing at the Millers' trailer on the morning of their murders. Nate said that he dropped by to catch up and also to take out a small loan for Big Mike. They had just wrapped up business when Big Mike's nephew, Clayton Gideon, had arrived with his daughter. Nate said that Clayton left at 10:30, and then Big Mike took a phone call shortly after that. And then after Mike got off the phone, Nate said his goodbyes. To this point, Nate's story about what happened that morning matched all the details the detectives already knew from speaking to Clayton and also looking over Big Mike's phone records. But then, Nate revealed something they had not expected. Nate said that as he was leaving, a woman arrived at the Millers' trailer. He said he'd never seen her before, but she looked like she was in her 52nds, maybe around 5 foot 4 inches tall, with a slender build and glasses and bangs. He said she had called out "Hi, Val" as she entered the mobile home, and she greeted Nate as he was leaving it. His best guess was that she was a customer, but she could have just been a friend. At that point, Nate said he drove off to meet up with his girlfriend, so he didn't know how long that woman had stayed at the trailer. The detectives got the feeling like things were speeding up again. They now had someone who was at the trailer during the 2-hour window when the shooting occurred. The detectives knew they had to speak to this woman, but they had to find her first. Stroud and Perry told Nate that a department sketch artist would be in touch very soon to put together a sketch of this mysterious woman. And sure enough, by the time the two detectives were back at the office, they found that the artist and Nate had already linked up, and the sketch was complete. Looking at the sketch, the detectives thought this woman looked like she could be anyone. But there weren't a lot of people in this part of Maine to begin with, so if this woman was a local, there was a decent chance somebody would recognize her. On December 1st, 2009, so 3 days after the Millers' murder, the detectives hosted a press conference where they officially disclosed what many people already knew. The Millers' deaths had been ruled a double homicide. Then they also released the forensic sketch of the mystery woman, saying she was an important person of interest in the case. Anyone who recognized her was encouraged to call the investigators as soon as possible. Right after the press conference, police posted copies of the sketch all over town, while others went door to door asking if anyone knew the woman. And soon, calls started to come from people all around the state who said they did recognize her. The detectives were just starting to look into these tips when Matt Miller's girlfriend, Tanya, finally returned their call from 2 days ago. They asked her where Matt had been on the morning of the murders, wondering if she would confirm Matt's claim that she'd spent the morning driving around with him looking for gifts. But instead, Tanya insisted she had not been with Matt at all that morning. She said on Saturday morning, Matt had walked out the door without saying where he was going. And for the next 2 hours, nobody could reach him, which was extremely frustrating considering they were supposed to be getting ready for their daughter's birthday party that afternoon. She said he finally returned around noon, but refused to say where he'd been. The detectives were astonished. Matt had clearly lied to them, and his own girlfriend was now saying that she herself didn't know where Matt was during the time of the murders. They considered driving over to pick Matt up for questioning, but decided to hold off until they could gather more information. The detectives already knew him and had a criminal record. There was an outstanding arrest warrant out for him for writing bad checks. But now Stroud and Perry wondered if he might be involved in more illegal activity. For the next 3 days, the detectives quietly contacted people throughout the area, pressing for information about Matt. And what they learned was that Matt was clearly addicted to prescription drugs and had recently begun selling personal items, including his own Xbox, so he could buy more. And Matt's older brother, Mike Jr., had told them that Matt had asked his father for a loan on the night before the murders when the brothers had dropped by. Big Mike had apparently turned him down, most likely because he knew Matt would simply blow the money on drugs. But the most damning tip of all didn't have anything to do with Matt's addiction or his criminal past. A local resident told the detectives they'd seen Matt's white Ford Explorer in the vicinity of his parents' house on the morning of the murders. This was something Matt had never disclosed to the police, and it potentially put him at the scene during the 2-hour window when Big Mike and Val were murdered. At this point, Stroud and Perry knew it was time to talk to Matt again. They were not quite ready to charge him with his parents' murders, but the facts were quickly stacking up against him. So on December 3rd, 5 days after the murders, they arrested Matt on that outstanding bounce check charge and brought him in for questioning. Once they put him in a room, they pushed him hard, telling him they knew he killed his parents. And Matt just denied everything, while at the same time becoming increasingly emotional. But after hours of intense interrogation, Matt stuck to a story that he never would hurt his parents. And even the detectives started to wonder if they had it wrong. So they ultimately sent Matt back to a holding cell and then stepped out of the interview room to regroup. And that's when they got a tip that reassured them they were on the right track. A local man called to say that on the evening before Big Mike and Val were killed, Matt had called him up looking to buy a gun. He even specified he wanted a .22 caliber pistol, which, according to the autopsy, was the type of gun used to commit the murders. The man said the firearm sale had not gone through, but the detectives figured Matt still could have kept on looking and eventually gotten his hands on a .22. With this new tip, the detectives marched back into the holding cell where Matt sat on his bed and told him what they'd learned. Matt immediately insisted that the tip was false, saying he never tried to buy a gun that night. But the stress of the interrogation was clearly wearing on him, and finally, he broke down and confessed, not to murdering his parents, but to lying about his alibi. He said that on the morning of the murders, he was meeting with a drug dealer not far from his parents' place. He bought some pills and then went into the woods to take them. He later lied about it because he didn't want to incriminate himself and because he was ashamed that he was off getting high while he was supposed to be getting ready for his daughter's first birthday party. Stroud and Perry were skeptical of Matt's tearful confession, especially after all the lies, but they agreed to check out his new alibi and see if there was any truth to it. The detectives began by pulling security camera footage from businesses along the route Matt said he took. It was a very tedious process that took 2 full days, as the detectives scrubbed hours of footage looking for Matt's white Ford Explorer. Stroud's eyes were starting to glaze over when Perry suddenly grabbed his shoulder and pointed at the screen. The footage showed a familiar car traveling away from the Miller's place at 11:00 am on November 28th, the morning of the murders. The detectives stared at the grainy footage, slowly realizing what this meant. The footage conclusively showed that the car's driver had lied about their alibi and had been close to the trailer around the time the crime was committed. Stroud and Perry leapt into action. They sent officers out to bring that driver in for questioning. But before the arrest warrant could ever be drawn up, Perry's phone rang. He answered it, and there was a woman on the line. Perry did not recognize her voice, but she told him she had vital information about the Miller's case. For a moment, Perry was ready to write this off as just another bad tip. He and Stroud had been fielding calls all week from people who claimed to recognize the mystery woman from the forensic sketch, and every one of those calls had been a dead end. But this one was different. The caller didn't mention the mystery woman at all. Instead, she said she actually knew who killed Big Mike and Val. And as the detectives listened to her story, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene, security camera footage, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Michael and Valerie Miller on the morning of November 28, 2009. Early that morning, the killer was home in their apartment, rifling through drawers in search of anything that they could quickly turn into cash. They'd already pawned or sold their video game console, DVD player, and sound system, along with pretty much everything else of value. Now, they were broke again and getting desperate. Suddenly, their hand closed around a metal grip. They pulled the object from the drawer, and they felt a rush of exhilaration as they stared down at the .22 caliber pistol in their hand. It wasn't what they'd initially planned to sell, but this gun could get them all the cash they needed. A few hours later, the killer was standing in the Miller's mobile home talking to Big Mike in the kitchen. After their desperate morning search, the killer finally felt calm. Finally, the conversation with Big Mike moved past chit-chat to business. The killer pulled the pistol from their jacket and held it out, asking how much Big Mike could offer for it. The killer wasn't here to shoot Big Mike. They had come to pawn the gun. Big Mike looked the weapon over thoughtfully, then gave his answer. The killer blinked, then shrugged and nodded, feeling a bit disappointed. It was less than they'd hoped for, but probably a fair offer for the tiny pistol. Big Mike handed the gun back over and said he would need to grab his business ledger from the storage room, and then he turned. But before Mike took a single step, the killer's finger brushed against the trigger. The hammer was still cocked from Big Mike's examination, and the gun went off. The killer jumped from surprise as Big Mike collapsed, his enormous body slumping to the floor of the kitchen. Val screamed and rushed into the room, instantly dropping to her husband's side. In an instant, the killer realized what they had just done. They had shot Big Mike in the head. Maybe Val would believe this was an accident, maybe she wouldn't, but right now, all the killer wanted was for her screaming to stop. Without really understanding why, the killer raised the gun and fired, this time on purpose. Val's scream was cut short as a bullet hit her in the head and she collapsed onto her husband. The killer just stared down at the crumpled bodies, horrified by what they'd just done. The situation felt so unreal. But as the seconds ticked by and Big Mike and Val didn't move, the killer knew they were dead. Then the killer realized that if they didn't want to spend the rest of their life in prison, they would need to get out of the mobile home right now. And they were about to flee when a thought suddenly struck them. They came here for money, and Big Mike would not be needing money anymore. Besides, it might be good for the killer if the police thought the shooting was part of a robbery. So the killer ran for the storage room. They threw the door open and stood there for a moment, taking stock of the guns and electronics. The killer knew they couldn't carry very much, so they decided to take the safe. Before leaving, the killer stopped to consider Big Mike's business ledgers. They knew these books would include the sizable loans the killer had taken out from him in the past, and this made the killer nervous. So the killer quickly flipped through the pages of the ledger books until they found one containing their own name. They tucked that ledger under their arm, picked up the small but heavy safe, and left the storage room. They avoided looking at the bodies on the kitchen floor as they shuffled past, and they just continued to drag the safe out of the mobile home back to their car. Before leaving, they doubled back to lock the trailer's door. With any luck, that would delay the bodies from being discovered and hopefully buy the killer a bit more time. A few minutes later, the killer was speeding away, and they were so focused on just getting out of town that they didn't notice the closed-circuit cameras aimed at the road. When Detective Stroud and Detective Perry reviewed the camera footage 2 weeks later, they didn't see the Whiteford Explorer they were looking for because Matt Miller was not the killer. It was Nate Nightingale, the best friend of Mike Jr., who the Millers had treated almost like a third son. The woman who had called in with a hot tip was Nate's girlfriend, and she told Stroud and Perry that Nate had come to her and confessed the crime. Nate was arrested on December 12th, and shortly after that, he would admit to everything. He said he really had gone to the Miller's place intending to pawn the gun. He needed the money so he could go Christmas shopping with his girlfriend. But while he was showing the gun to Big Mike, it went off by mistake. And when he realized what he had done, he panicked and intentionally killed Val. Nate also admitted to fabricating the story about the mystery woman. He said she was just a red herring to keep the police off his tail. She didn't exist. Detectives Stroud and Perry didn't like to admit this, but Nate's ploy almost worked. The search for that mystery woman burned up a lot of their time, and if they hadn't stumbled upon the security camera footage of Nate's car, it might have saved him. But now that they knew the truth, they looked at the forensic illustration again, and they noticed something they hadn't before. The woman in the sketch looked shockingly similar to Nate Nightingale himself, down to the narrow face, thin nose, and glasses. Nate had intended to throw the police off his trail with this mystery woman, but as he gave them details for the sketch, he sort of subconsciously wound up describing himself. It was almost like his guilt over murdering the people who helped trace him was so great he could not let himself get away with it. Nate was sentenced to 40 years in prison for murdering Val, Big Mike's death was treated as manslaughter, for which Nate received 15 years to be served concurrently. Big Mike and Val's sons, Mike Jr. and Matt, sat stone-faced at the sentencing while Nate tearfully apologized for destroying their family. Neither brother responded, but they stayed and watched while he was led away in handcuffs. Ever since, the two brothers have celebrated Matt's daughter's birthday a week early so that on November 28th, they can also remember their parents. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.